So who am I? I am a web developer. That's the title I identify with most. So when I'm at people's weddings or I'm being introduced to people and say, hey, what do you do? Instead of saying, I work in IT and wait for them all to skedaddle, I say I'm a web developer, which has an air of mystery to it to kind of keep them interested, but not enough detail to kind of make them think, oh, I know exactly what that's about. So who's the talk aimed at? It's going to be aimed at both developers who are fairly new to the occupation. So perhaps if you're a site builder or you are someone who is a product owner who's looking to do more development duties, this could be quite interesting for you to see what people with a little bit more experience who may be involved with coordinating development teams, the kind of things they might be looking for, but also on the other side of the fence, where you should maybe concentrate your efforts on overall. So perhaps instead of learning the intricacies of the latest framework, maybe take a different angle. Also, I think for experienced developers, it's also quite useful to have affirmation over the course of your career. So if I'm saying things to you that, you're saying, well, I know that, I'm doing that, that's great, fantastic, keep doing it. If you learn something new, I'm going to consider today a success. And for team leaders and managers, again, because I've kind of grown into this role a bit and I deal with quite a wide range of characters and, developers are people after all, they have different interests. It can be useful to kind of see things from the other side of the picture and then try to marry both parties' expectations to try and get the best of them. But fundamentally, it's aimed mostly at developers, because that's where I come from. And that is essentially repeating exactly what I've said. But we're also going to look at, well, this basically forms the backbone of the presentation. So the title should match up if I've done things correctly over the last few days. I'm going to touch on a few things which I know Emma was talking about during the keynote today, and I think is an increasingly common trend at a lot of technology conferences. I think personally that's a really great thing because it's tackling on some of both the stigmas and issues that have maybe dogged the community for quite some time and are still an issue. But I think the fact that more people are discussing it, the more open they are about it, I think the better that is for everyone and the happier everyone's going to be. I'm also going to talk a little bit briefly about things like recruitment because that is an aspect and facet of my job, and I think it's an interesting thing to touch on because it's a very subtle area in many respects. And at the very end, you've got to leave something good for people for paying attention for at least 20 minutes. A couple of books and resources that I found personally quite inspiring. It's not much. And hello. Hello. Hello, that was not planned. Stop it. So first of all, I think we should talk a little bit about what does a developer mean? And I think, I want to cover the stereotypes. This kind of originated from a couple of weeks ago when I was watching Mr. Robot with my wife on Netflix, and I had to turn it off after 45 minutes. I couldn't watch it anymore. It was unbearable because it was just, for me, promoting the stereotypes that these technically gifted people are somehow these weird cyber knights who are isolated and misunderstood, and they wear hoodies and they pore over code in the Matrix style. And no, I just couldn't deal with it anymore. And on the other side, this is one of my favorite XKCDs. I think it's number 303. Could be wrong about that. But again, it's like the traditional view that managers might have of like, can you get back to work? It's like, no, my code's compiling. I'm really working, but really I'm sword fighting. I don't believe that sort of thing happens too often, but it's also important to have fun at work. So fundamentally, I think the stereotypes around developers are that maybe they're a little bit isolated, perhaps sometimes, maybe misunderstood, because what they do is inherently complex. Development with software as well is comparatively, I think, a relatively recent thing. There's Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, SQL Server Database Administrator that have been around for ages. And I think in many respects, if you're an accountant or a builder, you've got probably decades, maybe centuries of heritage and process to fall back on, and people understand those things. If you're working with Angular, how long's that been around for? It's a complex area, and you're working in a field of work where people are asking you to produce things that are going to underpin what they do as an organization, but using tools that you're probably learning as you're using them. And I don't think there's many careers in the world where you have to basically make it up as you go along. There's a really great advert for, it's supposed to be Delta Airways, maybe a spoof one, I hope so, where they said, if software engineers built airplanes and, there's people flying along and there's like holes where the windows are and there's someone trying to have a cup of coffee and it's blowing in their face. And I found it personally quite funny, but maybe not for everyone. So next slide. Developers are like anybody else. They are people with different strengths, values, interests, culture, shortcomings sometimes. And I think what's I kind of categorize this as knowledge workers along with architects and people that essentially not sitting in a construction line doing very simple repetitive jobs. You are applying a specialist knowledge to a problem, and you're using specialist tools to do that, and you're making informed decisions along the way. That's pretty cool, you know, don't forget that. Now the big paragraph underneath that is something that I thought, well, I'm going to put my marketer's hat on a bit and like try and zazz this up a little bit. Enable change and value generating processes. So that, I think, is a fancy way of saying when you go to work for an organization, another person, yourself perhaps, what you're doing is you're applying that knowledge and you're making something happen at the end of it. And that happening might be something that creates value, and that could be social value, it could be monetary value, it's probably a big mix of all of those things. But fundamentally, you're probably going to be working with other people as well, hence organizations, and you're supporting them by either providing those tools or you're providing them expertise and advice so that they can effectively reach the same point. I don't really like writing stuff like that for the most part. I find it quite imperceptible, but I do see that style of writing quite often in proposals and also job descriptions. I'm going to move on to crises, and this is something, again, I think has got a lot of traction lately, and it's not to be trendy and include it. I think these are very important considerations. And imposter syndrome is the first one I want to talk about. And I was feeling a little bit lazy because I couldn't quite put my finger on how to define this myself, so I went to Wikipedia. So your mileage may vary, but this is kind of the Wikipedia version of how this is defined. Like Emma's pointed out this morning, I think, and it seems to be well regarded, that this affects most people at some point in their careers. I've suffered from it. I still do, a little bit, standing here. In fact, I got the old sweaty palms. I was waiting up on the back row thinking, I'm not quite sure how this is going to go. The biggest fear I had was actually the AV equipment, because I don't really do this sort of thing that often, and it's always a bit of an unfamiliar area, and if you get it wrong, it always sets you off on a bit of a bad footing. So thank goodness it went okay. However, how do we go about dealing with things like this? I think we can talk a lot about what it is and the symptoms, but I think Emma's done a great job of that already, and I think there are many other sessions out there that deal with this sort of thing. So if you need more information, there'd be a great place to look, or come chat to me afterwards. And I think for me personally, mentoring is a really great way of reaffirming that what you're doing in an organization is the right thing. Now, I'm not saying it's always the right thing, but having the ability to check in with someone is really invaluable. And that just having the small minor course corrections if you need them, or just being told what you're doing is right, really helps you feel like you're part of the project you're attached to. Something that kind of borrowed from a friend of mine who tried something called cognitive behavioral therapy was a thought diary and analysis. And I think I wrote down a technique where at the end of each day they ask themselves 5 questions to try and dispel this kind of slightly irrational process of feeling like you're not at the same level as somebody else. And there were things like, what was the best thing that happened today? What could I have done better? What's important for tomorrow? What new things can I try tomorrow? And what are they all for? And actually, when you reach the end of that process, if you do this regularly enough, you do find it focuses your train of thought, and it reduces the kind of myths that you sometimes pull together in your head to artificially compare yourself to other people that you're working with. It can be quite helpful. And I think it's important to probably distinguish this from something that's a bit more far-fetched, which is depression, and obviously there is a bit of an overlap between the two. I think that's something that's a lot more serious and can have some real long-term impacts on people's lives and careers. Definitely seek out support networks, doctors, etc. Don't feel afraid to go and chat to someone about it, or your employer, even your line manager. I think that's what they're there for, and they should take you seriously. The next stage would be, for me, is burnout. I've experienced this myself. It's not particularly fun. It is pretty nasty. And again, feeling lazy, went to Wikipedia, find a better definition than I could summarize myself. But you know, you can feel it sometimes coming on where you feel, I'm not really engaged in this project anymore, I'm feeling a bit snappy, and you know, sometimes it can be a very subtle process. And if you take a step back and just kind of retrospect on how you're feeling and how you're behaving towards other people, you can sometimes see those symptoms and take a bit of remedial action, whether that's retreating to a happy place or take yourself away for a while so you can get back to a more stable footing. But I think what's really important is managing expectations and being realistic with yourself and other people as well. And if you can, it makes a real difference to take control of your own priorities and schedules and make sure they're aligned with that of the work that you're doing. One of the most stressful things you can have is if the values that you have aren't shared by the employer you have or the project that you're attached to. And if you have a cultural mismatch between the two, then you can reach a burnout stage very quickly indeed. Staying relevant, or the relentless march of technology, if you want to give it a snappier title. I've lost count the amount of times I've thought to myself, oh, you know, I really wish I could spend the time to learn about this particular subject, and everyone seems to know about it. It's the latest great thing. And I don't know if if Angular 4, why is it called Angular 4 instead of Angular 3? And Drupal 8, what about that? If I don't know about the details, I wouldn't consider myself employable, and I'm going to end up where I am at the minute in a bit of a rut. And something that I guess I sympathize with a bit more now with the young family. I'm spending all my day coding or dealing with that kind of thing. Is it reasonable for me to have to do that again in my spare time afterwards? I mean, I've got other interests, and it's not all about code. And I think the best advice I've ever come across is it's not so much about learning the implementations. You can certainly look at the high-level overviews of new technology, but if you spend all your time learning the exact implementations and features of these tools, I can't see how you'll have time for anything else. But if you learn patterns, techniques, common solutions to problems that you typically encounter, rather than the frameworks and technologies themselves, that in itself is going to underpin your skill set and your career far greater than, Angular 4 might have in 5 years' time. So, I'm not saying you have to go away and learn how to balance a binary tree, but if you're interested in that kind of thing, it can definitely help your sort of skills of problem analysis and you know a bit about it, so you could talk about it later. And I think the key thing is, be curious, but be reasonable, and to follow the things that interest you in particular. So, if you want to, as I saw a video a couple of months back about two people pairing single-cell cellular automata based on a certain pattern from Wolfram Alpha, and it took about an hour. Didn't really achieve a huge amount at the end, but it was kind of a fun process of just exploring. And that process of learning, regardless of the subject, is probably the thing that I'd like people to take away the most from today. And on the flip side, stagnation. Is what I'm doing now satisfying my needs and interests? And I've asked myself this many times in the last 10 years or so, and in some cases it's a kind of temporary blip, and you think, well, I'll ride out this project, I've kind of got the best out of it, but I'll come on to something a bit more interesting later. But I think there's an analogy of the rolling stone gathers no moss in I think it's called Japan, possibly, don't look it up. And in that case, I think it's good not to dwell on things, whether they're good or bad. It's always important to keep moving, keep fresh, keep learning. And if you do those things, I think, it's a persistent feeling of educating yourself and bettering yourself. And naturally, I've got some nice motivational stuff at the end from Steve Jobs, who I don't agree with for everything. But that's a really nice quote, I think, that says, keep yourself current and relevant where you can. So I'm going to dwell a little bit on this slide for quite a while, because I think this is really the crux of this talk. And these are sort of traits for success that I feel were most important for me developing as a developer, and what I've seen show well in developers I've seen kind of grow over the last few years. And I think it's both a recognizing and summarizing what we've just covered, where developers are not these isolated automata in an organization where you punt something over the fence to them and they rattle a keyboard and something comes out the other side. Developers are part of teams and processes to produce things, so you're working often with other departments, marketers, product managers, even directors, if you're at that kind of level. And everyone communicates in a slightly different way, and I think the ability to empathize with the people that are including you in the work they're doing is really, really important, because you could be the best coder in the world and you could be fantastically efficient, but if you're producing the wrong things, then it's all for nothing. So being able to empathize with what other people are wanting from you and how they're asking for it, and communicating effectively with them is really great. Situational awareness is somewhat related to that. That's kind of understanding the why of why you're doing something. So if I'm working on something, I need to satisfy that for myself. I need to understand the bigger picture. I'm not a task-driven person. And I think when you change your mindset from being focusing on one ticket or task and finishing that, and move it to what are the outcomes associated with this, and become a results-driven developer, then you put yourself in a far stronger position to both enjoy your work a lot more, the quality of your work improves, and then when you move on to subsequent tasks, you can start joining the dots between those things and making it a more well-rounded experience. Situational awareness also comes down to a more day-to-day level, so the thing I do is check people are actually logging their time and making sure that we're not writing off things for silly reasons, and being able to kind of sandbox your time to explore unfamiliar ground is again a really important attribute to develop. And being able to do that in an intelligent fashion and be reasonable and communicate with people so they know what you're doing takes the pressure off you, because you don't feel like you're doing something unreasonable or you're taking too long to do it, but it also keeps other people informed about the complexity of what you're doing and the uncertainty, which again in this line of work is something that can be quite considerable at times. Curiosity and interest, again sort of touching on that mindset of perpetual learning, perpetual interest in how something works, getting to the bottom of it, and I guess following it up underneath it, having the determination to kind of see that through. And so much of being a developer, or I guess even an engineer in many respects, would be to spend, there are bouts of immense productivity, then you hit a problem, you spend a long time batting your head against something, you just can't get it to work, and then as it turns out, it might be a small configuration change, or somebody comes up with a nice idea for you to try, and that's it just clicks. But quite often I see junior developers that maybe get a little bit frustrated with the amount of effort, or worried that things are taking too long and their expectations are a little bit out of sync there. And over time, you start to realize that it's more important about having that persistence to really pursue that problem and see it through to its conclusion, or at least come up with some creative compromises along the way. And I think where my mum's from in Finland, have we got anyone who's Finnish or any kind of relation to that region? No. Okay, that's fine. The Finns have a great word for this. It's called sisu, which is a kind of real deep-seated determination and grit. It's probably the best way I can describe it personally. Maybe this is why they go swimming in cold lakes in the middle of winter. I don't know. But over time, I find this is a kind of skill that develops, and really kind of not being dissuaded when things get a little bit tough is really vital. I think we've touched on communication and collaboration. Let me just see my notes, whether I've got anything important there. Yeah, I think actually what I'm doing now is a good example of it. I'm not a natural public speaker, I don't think anyway. I've always been, I think like many people, a little bit anxious about standing in front of people, telling them what I think, because you put yourself in quite a vulnerable position. But that's okay. Actually, that feeling of anxiety, frustration, generally, not getting the exact result you want straight away. For me, that's all part of the learning process, and I think over time you get to a stage where you feel like those feelings, those sensations emotionally and sometimes physically become quite familiar, and actually, for me, it's reassuring to know that that's actually a very normal thing to happen. And whilst it can be a bit frustrating in the immediate sense, I know that to keep pushing at that, eventually you will break through somewhere. Collaboration as well is really important. So, at Torchbox we've got teams who work on projects, and everyone's got particular strengths, weaknesses, and it's important to try and sort of weed those out and see how well you kind of interlock and complement each other. And I think this also extends beyond the technical. It also covers your clients and who you interact with, and learning how to get the best out of them and communicate to them. Those sorts of things, and I'm not going to dwell too much on tools, because that's like a whole other session altogether. But learning how to do that effectively is definitely a subtle thing. And if you do have a mentor at work, or if you're a freelancer, those are things that I think support networks, line managers can all help you do. And the more you do them and the more you flesh them out, I think the better you are at communicating and the more confidence you breed with the people that you work with. And when you have that, when you have those trust levels, everything works a lot smoother. You're not having to constantly justify things and fight against the system. You just kind of, people trust you to get things done. And I think finally in there, humility and a proactive mindset. I think having worked in some teams long ago now, thankfully, quite strong characters in there with some very strong opinions, to the point where they're very dismissive over the views of other team members who, in many cases, had very valid contributions, but were very afraid to voice them because they didn't want to be shot down or called stupid, etc., etc. And I think even if you're a very talented developer, the moment you become overtly critical or dismissive of your team members' opinions, contributions, you start working against the output of that team. And you may not realize that at the time. And I think it's really important that people recognize this and flag it with people in a constructive way and say, this is just not the outcomes that we expect. So remaining humble, so, listening to people, considering their opinions, and just recognizing that you don't know everything is very useful. And a proactive mindset is possibly something in an agency environment is a little bit more pronounced, but often you will get clients who will ask you, they need a certain outcome and they leave it to you to determine the decisions on how to get there, and others who maybe have enough technical knowledge to become a little bit dangerous and will start telling you how they want it built. And over time you tell them that's not quite the way I would do it. Being proactive means, for me, being able to recognize where there are maybe a number of different options. And maybe this is especially pressing with Drupal as a technology, because often there are many ways to achieve the same result, often with their own trade-offs. And being able to balance that with maybe real world pressures, whether it's timescales, budgets, people's levels of familiarity with the tech involved, taking that all on board and being able to craft it into something that is not just, no, you can't have this, or you will get this, is saying, we could do this, and that's fine, but it involves maybe a little bit more time or money. Our recommendation might be to do this particular implementation that's maybe a suitable compromise, but giving them ultimately the kind of good feeling of being the person in charge to make the final call. Those sorts of things generally kind of grease the wheels of communication and get better results than just a flat no or blindly following the client's dictation in that instance. And I think finally, being brave and being able to say no, these are two things that are harder than they sound. So being brave could vary considerably for person to person. I think for some people, standing where I am now and talking to an auditorium would be quite frightening, and them actually stepping up to the plate and doing that for the first time should be, admirable and applauded. But being brave can also be saying no to a client or a colleague who wants to do something in a certain way, and maybe it's not going to go in the right direction, but maybe they've got quite strongly opinionated on it, or it's a fast-moving project, and your decision or that feedback is going to make things awkward for everybody. Having the confidence, or at least maybe not so much confidence, but the ability to say, I don't think this is right, and being able to justify it clearly and reasonably without getting too upset. Those things are, they're brave, and I think when people do that, kudos to them. And saying no, I have to do this unfortunately quite a bit in a kind of more project design role, and often people want the moon on a stick, and they often don't have the time or the money to back it up, or it's just not feasible. And being able to say no in a constructive manner, I think, feeds back a little bit more towards a proactive mindset. But you do get weary of it after a while. If you're constantly saying no to somebody, it makes you feel like you're the bad person. And it could be a client, it could be a designer who's creating something that's really ambitious for them, and you maybe can't implement all of those bits, so you need to negotiate it. But being able to do that in a constructive manner and involve people in that process, again, these are things that I think will serve anybody really well in the organization they go into. It certainly serves you better than saying yes in the hope that you'll satisfy them today and then let them down a week later when you can't quite realize that and you've been working long, long hours to try and get to that point. Let's touch on recruiting, everyone's favorite subject. We won't talk about recruiters, by the way. It's not good for my mental health. What do employers want and what do developers want? Having seen it from both sides, I think employers' wants and needs vary considerably, but generally looking to expand the capacity of their teams, the expertise within their organization, or sometimes they're just looking for an investment towards a particular vision of that organization. So when you're looking for a new developer, you're going to ask yourself, what kind of qualities do they have? What kind of technical skills and competencies do they have? And it's not simply a case of just matching up acronyms like PHP, Java, ODBC, if you're really old, those sorts of things. Because ultimately, you might get someone who's really gifted in those things, but they might not be a particularly good asset to your organization, either because their personal cultures are different, or their values are different, or what they want from the particular role is not something you provide them. So in many respects, what an employer wants is actually quite hard to sum up in a job description. And likewise, I think developers is a similarly complex and subtle picture. But for me personally, if I'm a developer and I'm looking for a new job, I guess I'd want to feel rewarded, whether that's financially, fuzzy feelings from working for nice people, maybe some extra bits and bobs on the side, those sorts of things. Really important, I think, as well for developers, I think, is the need to feel stretched and challenged. If you're going in to do a menial job, it's not really going to have that much sway with you, and chances are you'll be in and out of that job pretty fast. And one thing that I'm really not a fan of is what I call the HR dance or the rituals. So, the language, interviewing in the very traditional sense, the suits, the ties, they're all kind of things that I don't think necessarily serve a useful purpose. And I think in many cases, when you are, as a developer, looking for a job, you want to maximize the overlap between what you think the employer wants. Maybe they haven't told you that, they might not even know it. And the things and skills that you offer is the immediate sense, but also it stretches way beyond that. It's you as an individual joining that organization. And I think sometimes those conversations can take time to develop, and I have real reservations about job boards and things that are like high volume, high turnover. And having worked on a job board in the past, I know all the kind of nasty things and tricks that recruiters put in there. And I think my takeaway tips would be, if you're a developer, is just to be selective, be honest, and a good covering letter really makes a difference. I like to think of the CV as the baseline of like a picture, so it paints out the lines of who you are and what you can do. But the covering letter adds the colour and the detail to it. So that really sort of grabs the person who's reading it and says, I should pay attention to this person and just make sure that their CV contains the bits that are important. If you don't do that, chances are you'll be consigned to the bottom of the heap. I want to have a note on the infamous 10x developers. Are people familiar with these terms at all? If you're not, a 10x developer is, I think, in short, I didn't go to Wikipedia for this, I'm going to make it up as in my head now, someone who can achieve 10 times the work of a normal developer because they're so darn good at what they do. Ditto for unicorns and ninjas. These are all kind of Silicon Valley terms. But they do exist. Basically, I've found in the past they are quite strongly opinionated and can be demanding. They can be very useful if what they want and who they are is well aligned with what you're producing. But you do need to be very careful about those in a particular organization. I think it's far better to concentrate on values, culture, and build those teams out over time. That says if you've got the benefit of time. And yes, a disclaimer, I'm not one of those people, and that's absolutely fine. If you're not one of them, I think, again, that's going to include the vast majority of people. Don't feel bad about it. I think even if you're an average developer, chances are you know an awful lot more than several people down the street, and I think that in itself is worth celebrating. So, well done. And just wrapping up now, some interesting things. These are the goodies I promised you. So when I was on holiday a while back, I did the really sad thing. I read a process book by the pool called Getting Things Done by David Allen. I don't agree with everything there. I think some of the methodologies are a little bit wooden and robust, but I think the principles of time boxing your attention and really focusing on things is really important. Cal Newport's a more contemporary book about similar things, and he sort of opens up with talking about how, what's his name, Freud, not the other guy. Anyway, some famous psychologist I can't remember the name of right now, would essentially take himself away to a small stone tower to write his works because he needed the focus to improve the quality of the work he was producing, to compete with Freud. And that's the only way he could do that. And I think as a developer, you need to clear yourself the space and time to be able to focus and get into the zone and really apply yourself. And if you're being constantly distracted by colleagues or project managers, whatever else, that's something that you need to nip in the bud. There's loads of detail in that book. It applies to absolutely anybody who's in that kind of knowledge working sphere. It's a pretty good read, actually. It's not that dry. The one underneath it is a bit drier. That's the Mythical Man Month, but it is a really good read, more so from a project management and resourcing side, which is basically boiling down to, if the shit hits the fan towards the end of a project and your boss says, let's chuck 10 freelance developers on it right now and get it done tomorrow, it doesn't work like that. And the final one is a bit of a hero of mine at the moment. I discovered this guy called Matthias Johansson, who's now a front-end developer for Spotify. He's got this great channel on YouTube, which covers anything from developer musings, about career progression and all the rest of the stuff that I've been talking about now, right through to some more focused stuff where he deals with, like monads in JavaScript and such and such. It's very sort of well put together, very honest series of videos. They're normally anywhere between 10 and 30 minutes long, so nice and digestible. And really that provided the spark for this talk, because he hit the nail on the head for so many of the things that I kind of recognized over the course of my career, but couldn't quite put my finger on. So well worth a watch. And that is the Monty Python foot, if anyone hasn't seen that. And that signifies the end of this talk. Not sure if time for questions or not.
Maybe one question, if anyone has one? Yeah?
There's one.
I've seen quite a lot of articles lately talking about kind of open plan offices versus boxed, and how some developers prefer to be slightly focused, and how some hate the kind of agency open plan. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. And again, it's not an easy one to square, because a lot of offices are designed to be open plan and accessible with a view of, what's it called, serendipity taking place. People pass in the corridor, they exchange ideas, and sometimes that does happen, but I think purely from a selfish perspective, noise cancelling headphones are great, but they are no substitute to being in an environment that's conducive for you being able to enter that state of mind where you can really apply yourself to a complex problem. And somebody coming over and tapping you on the shoulder saying, "Can I ask you a question?" Well, you just did, breaking your flow. That could take you 10, 15 minutes to get back into. And that in itself is, a lot of people brush it to the side, but over the course of the day, that adds up to a lot of wasted time and mental energy. So personally, I would prefer a mix. So I have like a general kind of breakout area in the middle, maybe of an office, if I had a physical office, but with the option to kind of retreat to more secluded areas that are quiet, so you can actually get that peace of mind, or the option of just working remotely. But fundamentally, I think it's about individuals recognizing what works for them, because some people do thrive in that open environment and others absolutely despise it.